6 of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. How must we interpret this? Because there's a propensity for us to get excited when we hear this kind of information.
I think it is good. It is warranted to be excited about this story about Africa's growth because it acts as a catalyst to attract more investment.
Right.
It puts Africa on the global map. It makes Africa to be noticed. But also, I think it's important to understand some of the underlying factors that generate this positive story. I think one of the reports, I think it was the Boston Consulting study on African lions in 2010, try to identify some of the factors that lead to growth in Africa. Some of the two important factors. One is a crisis factor. If there is a crisis, if there is a sense of urgency, as was the case with a global financial crisis, countries tend to respond with a bit of robustness. The second has to do with countries that are coming out of conflict situations, out of war, and there is a great deal of pressure to reconstruct those countries.
Right.
And there are a number of others. There is a commodity story in Africa, which is driven largely by Asia. So even though we have to be excited about the story because it puts Africa on the map, I think that there should be a bit of caution, and we should examine
and obviously the
fundamentals.
context, the fact that governments have had to come in more robustly, as you're saying, with public spending to try to cushion the effects of a loss of FDI or aid or that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Now, we as Africa are in the rungs with Asian countries like China. And comparatively speaking, how do we interpret this fact? Because China is growing in the region of 8 to 10%. They've got good infrastructure. They've got a huge market, over 1 billion people to tap into. They've got a strong manufacturing base. Some of these African economies don't have that, and yet we're calling them the fastest growing economies in the world.
I think before the general story, I think something has to be said about Rwanda in particular, because there you do find some exceptional actions taken by the government. If you generally listen to investors who talk about emerging markets in general and African countries in particular, there is a lot of skepticism largely around institutional voids, lack of market institutions, poor infrastructure, absence of intellectual property regime, difficulties in doing business. Now, with Rwanda in particular, you find a government that is very serious about reforms, that has demonstrated a sense of urgency in developing the economy. Now, there is, if you look at Africa and China, there is what could be called a matching principle, because Africa has what China does not have in the form of resources, agricultural land, as well as vast mineral deposits. So Africa becomes an attraction to China. You cannot compare the two. I mean, China's growth comes off a it's a diversified economy, whereas if you look at most African countries, they depend on one or two commodities.
Okay, let's bring Qobo into this conversation. Using GDP as an indicator, is that often a good indicator of the true story?
GDP in various economies can mean, it can mean different things for different economies. So let me put it to you in an African context. We talk about 6 countries in Africa being leaders as far as GDP growth is concerned. And that's a growth spurt that comes from a very low base, and it happens very, very quickly, and then it could potentially drop back down again if the stimulus goes away, whatever is driving our GDP growth. It's a bit like a small company. A small company can go through growth spurts. It grows tremendously, and then it consolidates, and then grows tremendously and consolidates. Whereas if you look at China, or you look at the West, we're looking at a very, very large country where it's just incrementally growing. Now, it's the incremental incremental growth that becomes really, really important from a valuation perspective, because incremental growth is straight line growth. It's something that you can model. It's something that you can understand over the long term. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't justify African growth, because Africa's got to start somewhere. So the question and the consequences for Africa, for me, is what is your natural competitive advantage in a country? How do you exploit that? How do you provide the trickling down effect, and then letting it play itself out for 20 years without things happening like what's happening in the Ivory Coast, intermittently? Because once that happens, you blow your growth out the water for the next 10 years because nobody trusts it anymore. And there, Rwanda is now a great example of that, you know. So the question is, as your incremental growth happens, okay, and you potentially go through a consolidation phase, how do you then continue to consolidate well, put money back in the economy, and then continue to grow?
Yep, just perhaps to bring in another dimension. I think that's valuable, but they also it's also important for governments to bring in flanking measures to support growth, so that you don't have once-off growth spats, and it's not incremental, it's not sustainable. Policies aimed at improving infrastructure, building institutions. Simplifying the business environment, so that there is confidence on a sustained basis from private sector.
I mean, I think what Mzukisi is talking about here is critically important. It's what we call, in economical terms, what we call Ricardian growth, and that's the one thing that Africa seriously needs, and that's the infrastructure. So Ricardian growth basically says, if you don't have the infrastructure, don't expect the growth to happen. It'll become this very erratic growth. If you put on the infrastructure with some of the money from whatever your competitive advantage is, you're going to create more stability and more stable earnings, so to speak, in your economy over time.
I think this leads to the next issue here, and that is, to what extent do these wonderful growth figures trickle down into the real economy? You spoke about a comparative advantage, and Zambia is on this list, and their comparative advantage is that they have copper as a natural endowment. We've seen the price of copper improve, and that has filtered through into a general improvement in growth indicators. But if I said to an average person in Zambia, hey, you're one of the fastest growing economies in the world, would that person turn around and say, yes, I can feel it in my pocket, I can do so much more with my buck?
Well, there's still a debate, I think, in the economic cycle around the extent to which first, there is positive association between growth and poverty reduction. If you compare countries that are fastest growing over a long period of time, and their levels of poverty. But also, I think 2 years ago, Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, sponsored a study that was headed by Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz to review the terms on which we understand growth. For an example, are there other factors that need to be taken into considerations that basically measure overall well-being of the people, the quality of life, what generates happiness, which could in turn contribute to high productivity levels. But very much, I think more practically, the kind of issues that the governments and those in power need to really focus on are the infrastructure, institutions, as well as socially inclusive, to ensure that growth is socially inclusive, measures that generate social inclusivity, and this would require a broader participation with stakeholders in the country.
I mean, you mentioned the fact that a lot of these countries were recipients of better trade or FDI from Asia, and we know that certainly the Asian countries, particularly India and China, have been very good in offering soft loans, for instance, in exchange for commodities. So they will build a bridge, they will build a road in exchange for preferential access to oil or whatever the case may be. Certainly in Angola, that's happening. Is that how we're going to drive this infrastructure agenda? We've heard pledges from African leaders. We're seeing bonds being launched to this effect. But what else can really speed up the momentum of infrastructure investment?
There have been suggestions that bond issues could generate the kind of money required to invest in infrastructure on a massive scale. I think some practitioners from the World Bank, Dambi Samoyo wrote the book Debt Aid, made similar proposals that we should look at capital markets to generate money for infrastructure, because this is commercially driven and it's less likely to be misappropriated. But also more substantively, I think while it is important to use this window of opportunity of Africa's commodities being attractive to Asia, we should not forget that it's important also for African leaders to take these rands and invest them towards broadening their economies, because we cannot, as Africans, rely just on commodities for the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, I was just going to add to this. I mean, while we're chatting now, the one thing that comes to mind is that this textbook's actually written already for us. And the reason why I say this is because if you look at the Western world, this is what they went through in the 1700s and the 1800s. This is going from pre-industrial economies, agricultural-based economies, and you're basically turning an economy into an industrialized-based economy. And you need a catalyst for that. Now, I mean, the Western world used different catalysts. They used the Industrial Revolution in order to achieve this, with good and bad effects over time. But one thing it did achieve was a general upliftment of society. The question is, what's that catalyst for Africa? And what does that catalyst look like? And I mean, Africa has to go find that.
Final question to you, Qobo, and let's be brief about this one. A lot of African growth has been precipitated by Asian growth. The demand for commodities, mainly in India and China, is what stimulated this rush for African commodities. But we are told that in China right now, there's a threat of rising inflation. And we've seen the Chinese government introduce interest rate hikes. We've seen them put caps on property investments, just by way of trying to curb unbridled spending in that economy. What sort of changes is this likely to create in China, and hence impact on demand by China for African goods?
Firstly, China and India not going to stop growing, predominantly because you just have the population groups that are just continue to be industrialized. So you're not going to, that's not going to stop. That's good news for Africa, because that'll precipitate growth in Africa if you've got the right skill set and you've got the commodities in order to support that.